Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Rabbi. So good to see you.
Wow, good to see you. Excited to get close to the end of chapter 5 and focusing on the middle of our last antitheses. I think we're still gonna have one more session after for the really strong last sentence of
Wow.
this,
One more.
but
Okay.
we'll try to hit 3 verses today. And you can start from what you can either start from 45 or you can start from the beginning of the antithesis, whatever makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside.
Well, thank you for the background. Maybe let's just start with 45 and 45, 46, 47 then.
Yes, please.
Okay. The Gospel according to Matthew chapter 5 verse 45 onwards. So that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you only greet your brothers, what more are you doing? What more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?
Wow. Okay. Calling out those Gentiles. I think he's talking to you, Isaac.
That's right. Yeah. So
Okay.
yes. Mhm. Well, I
let's
have a
get,
yeah.
yeah,
Go
let's get
ahead.
started. Okay. So let's just start 45. And I thought it's a really good place to start because if I would say to you that Jesus or God is your Father in heaven, and Isaac, you are a child of God, or the Christian community are the children of God, or humanity are the children of God, all those statements would come off as kind of on the ball. You'd say, I have no religious qualm with that statement. So I figured we'd just analyze that
Mhm.
statement for a second and put it in context before we even understand it. Is that this is one of the only antitheses where Jesus seems to be trying to justify himself. If you see, what's the reason that you should not, get divorced, or what's the reason you shouldn't do adultery? A lot of time, Jesus is not as focused with explanation. He's kind of teaching you how to live a good life. But over here, we seem to be very, very focused on the explanation. So let's just give a quick comparison to the last antithesis on retaliation, where it says eye for an eye, and then says turn your cheek, and then it says if you want your clothing, and then it says if you want to go the extra mile, and don't refuse anyone. The end. This is a way to be a good person. You should do more than you have to do. But yet, when we get to this one, this antithesis, specifically on love of one's enemies, we have the verse. We say Jesus goes 1 mile, go 1 mile past that by doing more for your enemies. But now we have a reason so that you may be a children of your Father in heaven. And I think we just have to note this, that why is Jesus focused on the last antithesis on the Sermon on the Mount? Why is there a focus on a philosophical or theological explanation for why one ought to love his or her neighbor and love his or her enemy? If anything, the idea of giving an explanation opens a Pandora's box for how people try to understand things. If I say, Isaac, cross the street, you'll say, well, if you have authority, I'll cross the street. But if I say, Isaac, cross the street because on that side of the street is where the bus is coming, you might say, oh, I know the bus comes on this side of the street too. The
Mhm.
second you give an explanation, it opens up the possibility of rejection.
Mhm.
So I think it's really interesting that we see that Jesus gives an explanation here, and that explanation is focused on kind of treating everyone equally. And I think the second that we want to have this attitude of trying to, treat your enemies and your friends equally, you could at least start asking questions on that approach. Does that make sense? Is that make sense in every situation? Maybe only in certain situations. And I think Jesus wants us to at least be aware of this opportunity. The evangelist wants us to know there's an explanation. And if anything, this explanation that we're given is shorter than the explanation we're given in Luke. Luke even further expands upon this.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that background and context. And so what I'm thinking about is in our last discussion we discussed where 543 and 44 43 and 44 were pointing to the sovereignty of God, that even though we have hate and neighbors and love and all this, it was pointing to this deeper truth that God is sovereign, nothing's beyond his control. Or that was the theme he was pointing to based on the work, he was quoting the work of a rabbi. uh, and so in a sense, isn't this building upon that? if God is sovereign and he's in charge and he's there, and if all that is given, then in a way, on verses 45 to 46, expanding as he's sovereign, he makes the sun to shine on both the good and the evil. He sends rain on everyone. Could this also be viewed as in giving the philosophical explanation for, or giving an explanation for something which wasn't explicit, was implied. It was implicitly implied in the earlier two verses.
It's possible. Let's play the devil's advocate for the one on retaliation based on what you're saying. When it says give away your jacket, give away your cloak, go an extra mile, you would expect to see, based on what you're saying, there should be a notion of, don't worry, you'll get more clothes. Don't worry, your other cheek will be healthier than it was before, more vibrant. We just don't see this explanatory nature in the earlier one. And again, there's nothing wrong with what you're saying. It's definitely a possibility that it's kind of fleshing out the theology, which is what I think you're saying. But it's not obvious why the theology wouldn't be fleshed out in the other ones. It's interesting that in rabbinic sources, sometimes we see that the rabbis actively would hide the reasons for things because they didn't want people to start asking questions. They want you to first follow. And again, I think we could open up that question for Jesus. Does Jesus want blind obedience when he says turn the other cheek, or does he want you to analyze and evaluate and assess the situation to the best of your intellectual, emotional, and theological abilities and say, well, this makes sense? A lot of times when we look at Judaism, there's definitely the sense of when you do sin, you bring an offering. A, B. And I think at least with the Sermon on the Mount, we have to be open to the possibility that there's certain higher level of self-assessment and individuality that Jesus is trying to allow for here. And that is highlighted by writing an explanation.
Yeah, and so on the topic, on those two options you laid out, as a Christian, I want to say it's more of the latter than of the former. But again, I think there are some places maybe
as a modern Christian,
as a modern Christian,
probably for a Christian for the overwhelming history of Christianity, you probably would have sided with the other side. And being a postmodern American Christian, you probably feel that your individuality has to be expressed more so. Yes.
More so, yeah, and because when we studied Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, we noticed that these were shooting for a very high standard, which is in some ways it's there and not there, or no person can attain every single aspect of the Sermon on the Mount. And so there's this element of here's what you want to do, that you be perfect, but you can't do it anyway. So
yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to note that as an idea that we should be aware of as we continue to read forward. When you continue to look at this verse, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, the phrase "Father in heaven" is a common phrase. I actually did a quick search of it in Mishnaic literature, and I found that it shows up 5 times. I'm going to give you like the quickest overview of those 5 times to see if you could have a parallel here.
Okay, so can I ask you, so why does it have to say Father in heaven?
Yeah, that's what we're about to discuss. That's what we're about to discuss.
Versus just saying your son. Thank you, sons be father. Thank you.
Right. So that's what we're about to discuss. So Father in heaven is definitely a phrase that was floating around the world in the first century. So I did a quick search of Mishnaic literature. I found, I'll give you really quickly, that we have that who makes someone pure or impure? Your Father in heaven. When it says you should be quick to do commandments and quick to do the will of God, it should be quick to do the will of your Father in heaven. It says two very famous stories from the Bible where it says that Moses raised his hands and the Israelites were victorious. Moses raised the copper serpent staff, and then the people were healed. And the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, in the tractate Rosh Hashanah, asks in 3:8, it asks both times, did the people look to Moses and they're magically healed? Did the people look to the serpent and they're healed and they win the war? No, they look towards their Father in heaven, Avinu Shebashamayim, and in both those situations, when they look towards their Father in heaven, they were successful. And then the last one, there are a couple more, but the last one is that we have that a person who's blind, they should concentrate on their Father in heaven. And that's Tosefta and Brachos, that we have this idea that if you don't know which way they're praying, you're blind, then you should look towards your Father in heaven. So I wasn't exactly sure there's a theme through all of them, but the one thing which I do think that we see is that, number one, it's used in stories. That when the rabbis want to tell you that they're talking about a story, it's a lot more common phrase, because we do have various ways to refer to God. You have the Holy One, blessed be He, is a very common one. Then you have the various tetragrammaton names of God, and then you have Father in heaven. So I think that we see over here that we use the word Father of heaven specifically in a situation where you want to know that God, it's the relatable God. That's, I guess, the adjective I'll use. The God that you could understand. It's that I look towards my Father in heaven and he can help me. It's not that the God that's the rational, hyper-rationalist God. It's the God that you could understand and have a conversation with and focus your energy when you're praying on him. Okay, good so far?
Good. So, is the Father in heaven similar to the kingdom of heaven? Right. In earlier verses with John the Baptist and Jesus, we say, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." So then we speak about kingdom of heaven, and now so in a sense we said kingdom of heaven is more, he was more pointing to something else. So is there a difference between as you noticed, right, as you highlighted, Father in heaven is mainly used in stories to highlight or to point or to accentuate this heavenly being. um, do you see a difference between these two, kingdom of heaven, Father of heaven, or in what ways are they different?
So I would say of those two phrases, Father in heaven and kingdom of heaven, the word that's inherently and intrinsically much more important is the word kingdom and Father. The word of heaven, from my perspective, is just saying that there's a metaphysical element to it. And there's a kingdom to come. There's a Father somewhere. So the word of heaven is just showing that there's this almost spiritual element to it. That's how I would say it. But what I wanted to, just like we always do, I like to show the difference between the Christian perspective and the Jewish perspective. What I would notice is that in all those stories where we see Father of heaven, what we don't see is a Father in heaven that in any way is viewed in a literal sense. No one said, there's a very famous phrase that you say during prayers, Avinu Malkeinu, my Father, my King. When you say my Father, it means that God kind of relates to you as a father. You say my King, it means God also relates to you as a king. But it's very rare to then say, and we are God's children. We do see that Moses is specifically told to relate to Pharaoh that the Israelites are Bani Bechori, my son and my firstborn. So we do have this idea that God sometimes relate to the Israelites or to peoples as my son. But I think the jump that Jesus is making here on the Sermon on the Mount is not that he's saying that so that you may relate to your Father in heaven, but by doing this is how you become the children of your Father in heaven. And I think this is the main point that this is trying to make over here. There's an idea that I started with and said that Isaac, you would relate to the idea that you're the child of God right now, or humans or Christians. But what Jesus is saying here is that it has to be something achieved. That this metaphor that the Jews would have had at the time period, that there's an idea of a Father in heaven, that is taken more literally, and the metaphor is expanded to say that not only is the metaphor of a Father in heaven, but there's also a metaphor of the children of the Father in heaven. So it's really interesting. It's almost like a second generation metaphor. If the metaphor of father makes sense, then the metaphor of child makes sense. But the metaphor of father might be intrinsic in the way that God rules the world, but the children one, if you are able to not persecute your enemy, if you're able to love your enemy, if you're able to not hate your enemy, then you may be children of your Father in heaven. And if you're not able to accomplish this, and I'll use your phrase because you brought up kingdom of heaven, this is the road to the kingdom of heaven. If you're able to accomplish this, then the Father in heaven is the Father for your kingdom of heaven. But it's only because you have your
kind of lost you when you said, like, if you do this, then you are children of Father in heaven. So where is that? Are you quoting a verse, or where is that?
I'm just I'm reading the verse here. So let's read it. I'll get a couple different translations. Maybe that would be helpful. So that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven.
That's right. That's 45.
So in other words, if you do this, that will make you into the children of your Father in heaven, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. In other words, it's not inherent, it's something that's earned.
Well, okay, I read this a different way, stating that you are by definition your children of your children of your Father in heaven, and because you're like that, you have to love your enemies, and because
but then it would be so that you are.
Yeah, so that
this is not an observation.
See, you may be. I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
okay,
and there may be Yeah, and I would say, there's different commentators who point out that whenever it says child of something, like child of man, son of man, doesn't really mean son of man, means mankind. And some people point out maybe this is just another way to say so that you might be followers of your Father in heaven. But if you take the literal interpretation that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, or your Father in heaven, that means that there's a way that's being earned, and that very much fits this idea of earning the place of being a child in heaven. Definitely fits in with the idea that we've seen of the Sermon on the Mount.
That's a great observation. I'm sorry, and thanks for highlighting that. Right. So it says so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. So there is an element of maybe, as in you may be not, which isn't contingent upon, on a person's living and so on. So what would be the opposite then? Let's say, so when you're saying you may be, what happens? What is the opposite of that? Is it you
You're
cannot be?
not counted as a child of God.
Huh. That's a very strong statement to make, right?
Yes, that's why I'm saying it's important. Isaac, when I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I play music. Do you hear it? Tell me if you hear this. No, I can't hear this yet. So okay, it doesn't work. So I was going to put like Avinu Shiva Shemayim, Father in Heaven, is actually a famous song that's saying. I was going to put it on for you for a second, but we could do it another time. Okay.
So when he said this, right, as in you could either be children of your Father in heaven or you're not. He was primarily speaking to a Jewish audience at that
Well,
time.
not only is he primarily speaking to the Jewish audience, but the last line in 47, there's a condescension
Yeah.
upon a non-Jewish audience. So yes.
Okay. So okay, let's go back to verse 45. So how would the Jew like would this have been would this have been accepted for within the Jewish world?
Well, I think
One
this.
could, so you start with the fact that because you're children of Abraham, that gives you, Jew by being a child of Abraham or from that lineage. Now he's saying, no, you have to do this to become children of your Father in heaven. So was this train of thought common within the Jewish world at that time, or was this? How do you understand this? This thinking within the Jewish world at this time?
Well, again, what I'm trying to add is that it would have been common to view God as a Father in heaven, but it wouldn't have been common to view yourself as a child of the Father of heaven. So I think what the way that Jesus is being revolutionary in this aspect is that he's taken the metaphor to a second generation metaphor, and saying that not only is whatever the characteristics of a father, but you also have the characteristics of a child, of a child of that father. And that might have been implied. If you say you're a father, then you're a son, that might have been implied. But I always viewed it as unilateral. God is my father, and therefore I want him to relate to me this way. But if I'm able to be God's child, then he has to relate to me that way.
Okay, I have to think about that. Thank you.
Okay, well, these are very complicated verses, so we'll do our best. So that you may be child of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rains on the righteous and on the unrighteous. So there's actually there's many examples of sun, the idea of sun, not son, the sun being used to both reward and punish. And I thought I'd just give you one or two examples really quickly, because I thought you might find them interesting.
So before we go there, right? So here he has these four different categories that some people are evil, some people are good, some are just, and some are unjust. Because he makes the sun to shine, and
Right. There's never an elimination of the concept of evil. This is actually the third antithesis that evil is mentioned.
Yeah. So what is the reason? Like, you know, evil and good? Yes, we know we can understand that. What is the need for just and unjust, or in what ways is just and unjust different from good and evil?
I'm not sure.
So if he had just said he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good,
why does he say both? Okay, so we'll explain that.
Why does he say just and like? Why does he have to add just and unjust? Because evil and good is good enough, right? He makes the sun to rise. He makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good.
Okay, so I understand your question. So I'm not going to give you a good answer. There's the simple answer is that this is poetic, that there's an idea called a biblical parallelism that a lot of times you see in Psalms, that one half of the verse will set up a second half. The whole second half, I'd say, is unnecessary. Sun parallels rain, evil parallels unrighteous, and good parallels righteous, even though they're put out of order.
Yeah, they're
Right.
flipped.
So I didn't see a deeper meaning in any of those things. For me, it was just that he wants to convey this idea. So let's talk about the idea for a second. So the sun in a desert. Yeah, Israel, Palestine at the time is mostly a desert, and we see that sun is one of the craziest things that it could be used to reward and to punish. So I found in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate of Odazar in 3b, it says a lot of examples. I'll just give you two. Rav Shimon ben Lakish, who was a Palestinian rabbi at that time, there's no actual hell in the future, in the time to come. Rather, punishment for the wicked will be meted out by the Holy One, blessed be He, because that's the phrase used for God there. He'll take the sun out of its sheath. There's this idea that there's a physical sun and a metaphysical sun. And once God takes the metaphysical sun and you start feeling the full glory of God through the sun, it'll allow it to blaze forth at full strength. The wicked people will be judged by the intensity of the sunlight, while the righteous will be healed by it. So this idea that God has this full force of the sun being like this almost angelic being, and if your metaphysical side could feel it, the unrighteous, the evil will be crushed by it, and the righteous and the just will be healed by it and enriched by it. So we see over here the idea of sun specifically is a concept that's used to both reward and punish. And I think that's exactly how Jesus is using it. Jesus is saying, for he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. That the sun is something that doesn't differentiate. The good and the good and the evil will both experience the sun, but they'll experience it differently.
So when he says evil and good, is he talking about evil and good in the abstract, as in, or he's talking about evil and good on people, right? As in, is he splitting people into evil people and good people? That's my first question. And then second one would be, you mentioned about the metaphysical sun. There's a physical sun and then the metaphysical sun. I mean, so when you say metaphysical sun, isn't that poetic, right? So one could use the sun to exemplify or use the sun as a metaphor to point to some of these theological truth that the sun will shine bright. I mean, sun as sun, and that'll do this and do that. Is that, I mean, is a poetic sun the same thing as a metaphysical sun, or is it different?
I think we always have to differentiate between like the concept and us trying to explain it. The concept here is the sun is something that is kind of universal, and the good and the bad experience it, just like God just is equally loving through the sun for good and bad. So too we should be equally loving for people when we mete out our love. So that's what Jesus is saying here. It's not like again, like I don't think it's more deep here, but I think what the depth that we see here is the fact that the actual parable that's used is the sun. Like if I had to say the most universal things that people experience are sun, rain, water, air, land, those are concepts. So two of those concepts show up here, and it's saying that the sun itself is something that God metes out equally. But I was just pointing out that in Talmudic literature, that when people experience the sun itself is used in this very eloquent and interesting and innovative way, that the sun is something that people both experience, but can experience as a blessing and a curse. And it's all about the attitude that you have to it. So when Rav Shimon ben Lakish says that God will take out the sun from its sheath, it's saying that it has a way that good people can see the good and bad people can see the bad, but God is kind of being universal by allowing people to experience that. So too, when you mete out your love that to good and bad people, you should be universal about it. So that's kind of what Jesus is saying. I'm just noting why he does sun, and equally rain. And when he sends rain is something that is brought so many times through Exodus and specifically in Deuteronomy, that rain is a reward for good action. If anything, I think there's a little bit element of subversiveness here, that you should realize it's saying that throughout the Bible, the Pentateuch, it says that rain is meted out for good action. And yet over here, we're seeing all of a sudden that God sends rain on the just and the unjust. There's so many stories I could quote off the top of my head. The most famous probably being Honi Hama'agel, Onias the circle maker, who lived a little bit like 50 years before Jesus, where he said, like, Everyone's like, you need to bring rain. You need to kind of, because God does not mete out rain equally. God uses rain as a way to punish the wicked and reward the righteous. And only people who have a relationship with God could beseech God for him to bring rain. So the idea that the sun and the rain are brought here in order to show God's universal attitude towards mankind, I believe is tremendously subversive for the way that people would have understood and experienced rain and sunshine in a desert atmosphere that only rained during the winter. Right now in Israel, there will not be a drop of rain. It doesn't happen. You don't need to bring a raincoat or an umbrella. You can buy a motorcycle because there's no rain, because it's understood that it only rains in the winter, and it only rains based on how righteous the people are. So I think the fact that Jesus is using these two examples, sun and rain, it's a very subversive way to understand how the Jewish people would have heard this, and they would have said, no, God does not mete out the sun equally upon the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous. God does not mete out the rain equally. And I think it's meant to show you that God wants you to understand the way that he's giving blessings to the world is not directly tied to the way of you being good or bad. I don't want to say it's Calvinistic, but it's in a way that God kind of does his, and God has his plan. You just got to do yours. But it's not about you praying or not praying. It's that this is supposed to be universal. And just like you're supposed to love people, so too God will choose rain and sun how he chooses.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think what this is, in a way, right? This also gives more. It probably builds on this. It builds on this theme of you love your neighbor, that one should not retaliate, one should not do this thing, because we as we discussed earlier, human life is fickle, or we don't have the sense of control is more of an illusion, and we spoke about God having him being sovereign. And so it's all of these again pointing to that deeper truth, as in God is sovereign. He pours out the rain without prejudice. And but to your point, as you mentioned over here, this would have been subversive. Now to the 21st century, this makes complete sense, because all men are equal. It rains, it suns. God,
because the rain comes from the clouds, and the clouds come from the humidity.
but back in that day, based on what you shared, right, this would have been subversive, as in that God giving out rain would have, and it was just meant to accentuate, was just meant to highlight that deeper truth, as in be kind, be loving of everyone, and whoever they are. Is that
Well, I think it's definitely meant to accentuate that, but it's accentuating that by telling them to reject the way they're living their lives in the past.
So was that meant to grab their attention, or was it meant to just, so the statement, right, that
I mean, everything that's subversive grabs your attention. I mean, that's what it does. Let me ask you a question, like just based on this, and I guess based on the next verse too. If you get no reward as a Christian, is that okay?
what do you mean by reward? So define
I don't know, whatever you think reward is. I'm not here to tell you what reward. I don't know, either a bunch of pearls in heaven, or sit with Jesus next to his seat and eat tacos, whatever you think you do in heaven. I don't know. Let's say Jesus never rewards you, and he says, you should worship because I am truth, but I'm not rewarding you. Is that okay?
I think isn't that the central theme of the Christian gospel, that you're called to worship God for who He is, not because of, like, God is not a cosmic vending machine. That because if I worship God, I'll get this, I'll get that. He's to be worshipped, and that's so. When you say reward, I'm not sure what's meant by reward in
No,
this case,
so
because
you're saying clearly. So I think when you look at the next verse, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? He's actually having a very negative attitude towards reward. He's saying that in short, the basic argument is that only people who you love, if they're the people who are close to you, then you're not better off than anyone else. You're kind of not better off than anything. Like, just like a negative. So it's better to just try to love everyone. Obviously, you're gonna love the people you love.
yeah. So can we focus on the word reward over here, right? So when he used the word reward, what did he mean by this now, or at least in the
I'd
first
say it
century?
means benefit.
So what benefit was he referring to in this case?
If you only love the people who you automatically love,
Yeah.
then you would do that anyways. There's no inherent benefit to that situation.
But okay, so I'm not tracking. So this was written. So he was speak Jesus as
Even
a
the
Jew.
most despised members of society show love to their loved ones.
Okay,
So
so
in other words, you have to go the extra step.
okay, I see. Okay, so through this was he pointing to this to the to the to the higher level, super arrogation level of that you don't, that you love,
Well,
you
again, I
don't.
think he's explaining his point here, though. That's what I'm saying. It's very rare for him to explain in such depth. But he says, he makes his point, but now he's making a philosophical argument on top of his point. First, he's saying you should love your enemy because, because of whatever. And then he goes on past that and says, by the way, this makes sense what I'm saying inherently, even if you're not a Christian. It makes sense that for you to love the people who don't like you, because even the most despised member of society love their family members. So if you want to be a good person, you got to do that. And he now asks the rhetorical question: do not even the tax collectors do the same? Don't the tax collectors, who are the most, Matthew the tax collector, the most despised person in society, even them, they also show love and benefit. So you want to go the extra mile in order to get the benefit out of it.
So in this case, right, so he's also acknowledging that the tax collectors were ruthless,
the most hated people. Yeah, absolutely. It goes on and on for all time. And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? So again, furthering the point, he expands each time. First, he says, what's the benefit? And then he says, even tax collectors. And then he goes and expands it even further to like only your people. The idea is that it seems you should be ubiquitously good to everyone, because that's how to be a good person. And he finishes again with the fourth question: do not even the Gentiles do the same? Isn't it make sense? Yeah. And this might be a criticism to point out that you don't want the Gentiles to be better than you. You should at least be as good as the Gentiles.
Okay, so by saying all this, were all these subversive in that time? I said that you greet only that if you only greet your brothers, are you saying greet everyone? Was this a subversive?
There's always been universalists in religion, right? There's always groups of people who would say, greet all different peoples. So I wouldn't count this as one of the subversive things, but I would count this as trying to point out that we should be better than we are today, and you should take action steps in that direction.
Good. Well, that's and it sounds like in this case, this is also a common theme within Judaism. Because there's nothing Christian in what he said over here. It's all he's speaking to a Jewish audience. He's saying,
I mean, last session we talked about how there's many commandments to hate the people who are bad for you. So I would say that is more the Jewish attitude. Hate the people. There's like we gave the example from Rav Yochanan that says that if you don't take vengeance on a situation that it's pedagogically justified, you're actually hurting the individual. So yeah, I think this is more Christian than Jewish. This attitude. Okay, okay. On that note, okay, go call today.
Okay, Rabbi. On that note, well, thank you. Thanks again for your time and discussion. Lots to think about.
Absolutely. Okay.